and with educating activities, sharing of our knowledge produced collectively through participatory action research and the involvement of leaders from quilombola, ribeirinhos, indigenous, and peasant communities. If it depends on our original people, the sky will not fail. Let's postpone the end of the world. Climate justice and well-being are the converging agendas of the People's Summit of 2025. We will have a lively and affirmative cultural program celebrating our pluriversal Amazonian identities. We will be able to experience our Amazon cuisine during the event and purchase our handicrafts and biogels. We will have a day of international with the Quilombola community of Itacuã in the municipality of Acará. Our invitation to each and every one of you who in the present at this conference is let's Amazonize the world together. Our forest has people. It speaks and teach its people to fight. Nothing about the Amazon without the people of the Amazon. Nothing about the Amazon without the people of Amazon. Thank you very much for staying here with us. I hope we have a great time together and enjoying Belém do Pará, Amazônia, Brazil in this international conference of the Network Climate Change. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thanks, Solomon. We'll move over now to Tracy, who will be chairing the opening session. Over to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. How do I follow from that introduction? But hello and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us online from across the globe. It's wonderful to actually see such a diverse audience gathered together digitally. Again, on behalf of the Climate U community and the panelists, we really appreciate you making space in your day or your night to be here with us. Welcome to our panel, our first panel for the conference entitled Higher Education and Climate Action in Times of Global Challenges. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tracy Yani Harjatanaya from Satyatera Bhinneka University, Medan, Indonesia, and I'm honored to be the chair of this panel. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person tomorrow, but thank you so much for arranging this digital online session for us to meet here. Now, when we look at the title of the panel, it may read simple, but we all know that it actually packs a punch, and in reality, it's very complex and messy. We meet at a moment many are calling a polycrisis, a convergence of interconnected global threats. We are witnessing accelerating ecological breakdown with record temperatures, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, crop failures, and extreme weather events. Yet these challenges do not exist in isolation. They are unfolding against rising economic inequalities, geopolitical tensions, renewed conflict, rapid technological and AI evolution, many other global challenges. Now, climate change is not only a scientific problem. Based on the research findings and the conversation we have had in Climate EU Network, climate change is a social, political, cultural, and ethical one. As Sonia mentioned earlier about the issue of climate justice, the impacts of climate change fall hardest on those least responsible and least equipped to respond. And the solutions are unfortunately still deeply affected by power, resources, and governance. Amidst this backdrop, the role of higher education is being questioned and reimagined. Universities are expected to do many, many things. For example, speaking from my own experience as a leader of Satyatara Bhinneka University, universities are called upon to, for example, generate timely, actionable research on climate risks and responses, prepare students with the skills and resilience needed for uncertain futures, bring together multiple stakeholders from government, industries, communities, civil society in honest, open dialogue to demonstrate credibility through sustainable campus operations and procurement. And last but not least, to examine and reflect critically our own role in universities in reinforcing or challenging unsustainable systems. But higher education itself faces a lot of pressures. So we've got expectations, but a lot of pressures as well, like constrained budgets, political interference, growing inequalities in access and quality, and debates over academic freedom. Curricula often remain largely disciplinary and can be slow to change. Institutional culture is resistant to change. Research funding skews towards incremental rather than transformative innovation. Many institutions struggle to match their sustainability rhetoric with actions. So, what should higher education be in this time of global challenge? What are its obligations? And how can it respond effectively when the international order itself feels fragile and uncertain? To help us explore these questions, we are very lucky that we are joined by three distinguished panelists, each bringing a unique perspective on higher education's role, on climate actions. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. We've got Marcia Mackenzie from University of Melbourne. Hi, Marcia. And then we've got Sunil Santa from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And finally, we've got Fatima Danton, United Nations University. Hello to Marcia, Sunil, and Fatima. Hope you are all well and ready for today's exciting conversation. We'll begin shortly by inviting each panelist to offer a 10-minute reflection on how higher education can navigate and respond to climate action within today's global constellation of challenges. After all inputs, we'll open up for questions and discussion. You are all, of course, invited to give remarks and drop your questions in the comments boxes at any point during the session. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Marcia to share her thoughts and kickstart today's conversation. The floor is yours, Marcia.
Thanks so much, Tracy, and everyone for those introductions. I'm calling in from Melbourne, or Narm, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Australia. And very pleased to be joining you today. I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne, and I direct the Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education Project, the MEACE project. And one of my colleagues will be speaking about our work in that project, I think, later today on a panel, and some of the results that we've had in relation to the higher ed sector in particular from across different country profiles and case studies and indicators that we've been developing. I thought this morning I'd talk about a new project that's a little bit of a, really connects into this idea of polycrisis. So it's a little more kind of conceptual, but hopefully will give some good provocations for thought and discussion. So I want to just start by referencing a novel by William Gibson in his jackpot science fiction novels, where a series of interrelated crises, so climate change, technological change, pandemics, and inequality, create this jackpot scenario, which wipes out 80% of the human population. So in many ways, this is no longer seeming just like fiction. And in this new project that's just been funded with Sam Seller and Sarah Truman, we're exploring how interrelated slow emergencies are now affecting, in particular, young people's sense of future and how policy change can be catalyzed in response, including in higher education. So slow emergencies can be defined as forms of crisis that occur gradually and out of sight, and therefore don't create enough of a policy response to address them. So for example, most people know climate change is occurring, but while in many parts of the world, we may have peak episodes like flooding or a bushfire, etc. The impacts are largely remain invisible in daily life, recognizing that's not true in lots of other places in the world where people are, already having to migrate or having their lives dramatically impacted. But a lot of places, including where I'm working in Australia, it's very much still in the background for a lot of people, and therefore we're not seeing sufficient action being taken in policy. So, a problem is because these just sort of go along over time, they're slow, slowly building, they don't register as capital E emergencies that might demand more extensive political or policy response. So like a flood would, or if a bomb goes off or something like that, where we know there needs to be a response. So as a result, they continue to worsen without action. However, research is suggesting that compared to other generations, young people are both more aware and more concerned about the effects of climate change and other slow emergencies. And there's growing worry that these combined effects of these issues on young people are really affecting their sense of having a future. And we see this sense of loss of future in young people suggested in rising rates of suicide in young people over the past 15 years. In many parts of the world, with self-harm the leading cause of death for young people in Australia, for example, and many other countries. There's also been a 50% increase in diagnosed mental health disorders in young people in Australia, as an example, since 2007. And there are similar statistics around the world. The 2024 Lancet Psychiatry Commission proposed that this global alarming trend of declining mental health in young people is due to global megatrends, including environmental and technological change, as well as the recent global pandemic. So this idea of a polycrisis, all these things coming together, that is just being, it's overwhelming for young people and many others as well. So, for example, 56% of Australian young people think that humanity is doomed due to climate change, with over 30% reportedly already having post-traumatic stress disorder due to climate change. And there are also similar types of data on how other interrelated slow emergencies are impacting young people, including those in higher education. So we know there's an uneven distribution of futurity in these slow emergencies, where even the ability in the first place to imagine and experience a future is shaped by one's geography, racialization, gender, class, and age. So in other words, slow emergencies remain unaddressed in part because it is marginalized communities that are most affected, including young people. So whose futures are being affected determines when issues come to be experienced as urgent capital E emergencies. So as a young person in one of Gibson's novels says, quote, "We have no future, not in the sense that our grandparents had a future. Fully imagined cultural futures were the luxury of another day, one in which now was of some greater duration." Higher education, however, seems predicated on a somewhat predictable future. So anticipated career trajectories with higher ed institutions as in part sites of training and career preparation, along with broader educational aims. And while recognizing that not all higher education students are young people, a considerable portion are, with many affected by these interrelated slow emergencies or other aspects of polycrisis that now look to dominate their unpredictable futures. Next slide, please, Tristan. So policy making more broadly has tended to maintain a liberal orientation to the future as anticipatory and with the expectation of positive change and development. Just, and a lot of people that are of older generations are still operating with that expectation and designing higher education in that vision. And then when we have a capital E emergency come along, these are understood as unusual disruptions to this normal trajectory, with the expectation that everyday life will resume once those are addressed. So, if we want slow emergencies to be addressed, the question then becomes, how do we turn them into more capital E emergencies for people in policy decision-making positions, including in higher education, to enable a more sufficient policy response to be catalyzed. So in our work, we're looking at how students can be problem brokers in opening windows for education policy change. Existing research suggests it's often narratives, including emotion, that catalyze policy change. So young people, students sharing their stories of the impacts of slow emergencies on their sense of future, along with data about these impacts, can help mobilize greater policy action. Another key criterion in opening a window for policy change is that the policy problem is articulated in alignment with the broader political context or the mood for policymaking, including the political dynamics of policymaking jurisdictions or institutions. So, for example, differences between conservative or right-wing and liberal or left-leaning institutional contexts or subnational, national contexts, and how those politics can affect the orientations to policymaking on slow emergency issues. This is especially important for the slow emergency issues of climate change and AI, pandemics, given political ideology and affiliation are the biggest predictors of concern and action on these polarizing topics. So when interrelated slow emergency issues such as these are currently engaged in education policy, it's typically in isolation, so just dealing with one, not looking at their interwoven causes and effects, and also with a focus on information about the issues rather than on the effects of these slow emergencies for students or on action that is being taken to address the issues. And I'd suggest that the extensive buy-in to the Sustainable Development Goals in higher education is symptomatic of and furthers this approach. With 17 goals to choose from, too many institutions seem to be championing their existing initiatives under particular SDGs, often without advancing anything new across the range of other SDGs. So the Times Higher Ed ranking, for example, has encouraged this by taking a pick and choose approach where institutions can select a few SDGs to report on to receive a ranking, often the area the institution was already performing well on. For example, even the SDG of economic growth, while leaving other areas such as climate action unaddressed. In a recent paper with Indigenous colleague Alex Wilson, we examined some of the problematics of a global policy approach to climate and sustainability action in higher education, using the example of the university we both were working at the time in Canada, which operated in a right-leaning political context dependent on a fossil fuel economy. And we compare the problematic approach of this university in taking up the SDGs in contrast to the promising approach of an Indigenous-led higher ed institution, also in Canada, but in the north of Canada, which was endeavoring to switch back to a locally Indigenous land-based policy framework for education practice. So coming back to the beginning of my comments, just to close, this kind of more contextually appropriate and holistic approach to climate and sustainability action and policy also can help mitigate the loss of hope in the future experienced by many students. We know from prior research that addressing feelings of hopelessness, including through seeing and participating in action, can turn students around from points of despair to instead having more of a sense of participation and belonging, and therefore hope in the future. Next slide, please.
Hi, Marsha. Sorry, just to interrupt there. The interpreter seems to make a comment. Would you be able to just speak a bit slower for her?
Sure. Sorry.
To catch up. That's all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry. So this is good because my last slide is just sort of a summing up of the the argument, I guess. I'll leave it here, but with some considerations for discussion. including we are experiencing interwoven global slow emergencies or polycrises, and this is having impacts on many higher education students' mental health and well-being, as well as obviously physical well-being, but honing in on the loss of sense of future component. There is a lack of adequate policy response by most higher ed institutions to such slow emergencies and their impacts on students or prospective students that may decide why go to higher education if we're, in a planet on fire that, there's no prospects for the future. It's important to better understand how to catalyze more adequate policy responses to the situation, including taking up the role of local contextual politics and fossil fuel economies in that. And then finally, how global policy frameworks such as the SDGs can play into the resulting gaps of policymaking. Could future frameworks have fewer loopholes that can enable continuing the status quo? These loopholes that enable us to continue the status quo despite the growing global state of multi-crisis? Or more broadly, we could ask, are global policy frameworks useful at all? Or how can they be more useful, including in a period of declining multilateralism? So I'll close there for a broad-reaching, hopefully some provocative thoughts for folks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marsha. That's such a provoking, thought-provoking kind of 10 minutes. Thank you so much for sharing. For the next one, can I please invite Sunil to share your thoughts?
Let me
Hi.
share the,
Yes. Hi, Sunil.
Hi. You can see the slides, right?
Yes.
So good evening, everyone. And I know that for some of you it is good morning, and for others it might be noon. But that is where we begin with the linearity of time itself collapses, and in one particular platform, we are collapsing the linearity of time into non-linear timing, and that is specifically what indigenous knowledge systems are about. And though our higher education systems and academic institutions are still pitched within what is called as a linear time or a linear knowledge framework, and though we are going with participatory action research and other forms of participatory research, still the concepts require collapsing to non-linearity as per the indigenous epistemologies. So that is where I am pitching my thoughts today. So just a second. So these are largely from my own personal experiences of working with local communities, and as part of the Climate U network, listening to many of your conversations earlier in the previous conferences, as well as in our network meetings, as well as when we work with both students and local communities, and when we use the word called action research, even this question of participatory action research, how much indigenous is how much are we able to connect to the local is a question that I have. And that is what I'm trying to share here. So even if you take in the indigenous ontology, and there are multiple ontologies there, but if you come to India, and one of the mainstream notions that you will come across is rooted in the Sanskrit words called Loka Samasta Sugino Bhavantu, which in a very simplistic manner, it might be that may all the beings be happy and free. And if I could contribute to that, that contributes to world happiness. That is something that is very interesting to be part of our own being and becoming. And now if you see, there is a recent short film that has come in Netflix called The Humans in the Loop, and where a group of women in a tribal community in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand in India, they are actually working towards supporting feeding data for AI firms, artificial intelligence firms. And there is one particular scene there where the photograph of a worm, of a particular caterpillar, was given to this particular woman who wants to feed that data. Now, what happens here is that when the woman, she is an indigenous woman, she looks at the photo and she has to label it as pest, P-E-S-T, pest. She has to label it as pest. But she says that in our community, we don't believe it is a pest. We consider that it only eats the worn out part of a tree or a leaf so that the rest of the tree gets protected. So it is not a pest. This is what she argues for. So, but then there will be a dialogue, a realization after that. So this kind of an entanglement between humans and the non-human is somehow missing when we talk about climate action today. So this is one important aspect that I want to bring. So here, when we look at human-nature connections and what we call as nature-culture entanglements, there is a kind of a relationality that emerges in everyday life. Now, how much are we as academicians or as researchers or practitioners able to articulate those relationalities into applicable concepts, into theories that local communities are able to deal with? So, for example, even as part of the climate research itself, when our students went to the local community, the regional language there was Tamil, and the students also knew Tamil. Though they sat in the class, understood what is climate change, the science of climate change, and when they went to the community, they translated climate change into a particular word in Tamil. And when they talked to the adults, they got a particular response that is not anticipated in terms of what climate change should be. So after a few visits to the community, when they built very good relationship with the children there, the children said to these students that in our place, we don't use this particular term for climate change. We use another term denoting climate change. What you are talking is about seasonal changes, and it doesn't reflect climate change. So this was what the children reminded our researchers. So this aspect of what we talk as climate itself, how much of this climate is locally rooted? Now, when you come to that question about how much of climate is locally rooted, when we go to indigenous populations, at least in this part of the world, what I have experienced is that for them, climate is not that is very much in a box where you can connect it to temperature, pressure, or wind speed, or moisture, humidity, etc. It is very much connected to the health of the forest. It is very much connected to the perspirations that are coming out of the forest, the dryness of the land, the moisture content in the land. It is connected to the dragonflies. It is connected to the kites. So all these is together, it is embedded as an organic whole, and that is somehow missing when we articulate climate change and climate action, even other concepts like what we talk about vulnerability, resilience. So what is happening as of now is that though we are talking about participatory action research or action research, we are interpreting in terms of the mainstream understanding of the concepts. Then we are extracting data from the local communities suiting this concept. And while we write and while we develop our theories and methodologies, we are again looking at the mainstream audience and not necessarily always the local communities and the intended changes. Though I accept that participatory action research has its agency to bring about meaningful changes in the community, I am not criticizing that. What I am saying is perhaps because our concepts are embedded in a very a dominant knowledge system that is not connected to indigenous knowledge systems, what is the true potential of participatory action research, we are not able to achieve that. That is my argument here. So as academicians in higher education institutions, we play a vital role in creating concepts and also knowledge frameworks that are as of now far away from grassroots realities. Because of that, our responsibility and accountability matters. We need to address the politics of translation here, and that means bridging the gap between concepts, theory, practice, and the intended outcomes of action research. So then we might have to rely on what is indigenous research methods. Participatory action research needs to go deeper into its own introspective self, trying to understand what indigenous research methods are. exploring the notions of how indigenous communities frame what is climate change, what is climate action, how do they sense it in their own understanding, in their own language, in their own nonverbal expressions, and how do they experience it. We can be participants in we have to become the participants of their framing, sensing, and experience rather than the other way around. And that will be the process of our becoming, our knowing, doing, and being as well. I think with this, I should end here. Thank you for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Sunil, for your insights and for introducing us to this framework. Before we invite the third panelist today, I just want to remind everyone that we do have Portuguese translation. If you are unsure, I know in my own kind of monitor, it falls under more. So if you can see that there is this button more, then you can find an icon that looks like a globe, which says interpretation. So if you need translation, you'll be able to use that button in order to help you get the Portuguese version of the conversation, which is largely done in English. So I hope that helps. Okay, so I will now resume and invite the third panelist. Are you ready, Fatima, for sharing? Hi,
Yes,
Fatima.
I am.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi, Fatima. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. Excellent. Thanks for inviting me to this conference and on this very important topic related to universities and their role, I'd say, in the poly crisis. I think there's been a lot of interesting points that have already been developed, both in the introduction by Sonia and also by Marcia and Sunil. And so I just want to maybe extract a few points and focus on those. First of all, I think it's important to remind ourselves, what are universities for? What is the purpose of universities? What service or what role do they play? I would argue that especially in this context of climate change, universities must extend a role that goes beyond just research. They must be able to engage us as citizens. So the climate citizenship, I think, is a very important point. And it has to be the knowledge that universities is generating, I'd say, should be grounded in some type of responsibility. Responsibility that would capitalize participation, but also inspire some form of ethical stewardship, I would argue. So I see universities as very important in that role, in that service. But I want to relate my sort of 10 minutes very much to the context of Africa and universities within that context. And I would argue that universities have evolved quite a lot from the early 60s, especially during the post-colonial era, to what they are now. What we see now is that many universities are very much trapped in this sort of traditional silos. They don't have much in the way of authority, especially in terms of curriculum. And they produce data, but often the data is not catalyzing action. And I would also say that most of the universities in Africa have lost somewhat their verve. They've lost that sort of critique role that they had in the 60s, where they were considered to be like a developmental sort of university and had quite a role to play as arbiters of knowledge. So I think it's important to see how how can university reclaim that verve? You know, how can they get some of that edge that they seem to have lost, and how can they speak truth to power? I have one example, a very sort of compelling example, I hope. If you take Ghana, for example, this is a country that is suffering from the impacts of climate change. And that impact is quite visible, especially in terms of the erosion of coastal lines, witnessing a lot of erratic rainfall, and also in terms of shifting agricultural zones. So what's happening now in Ghana is that cocoa is a staple crop. So Ghana is a producer of cocoa. But many of the cocoa farms, which, as I mentioned before, is a staple crop, and that's the sort of backbone of rural livelihoods, many of these farms are now being substituted for gold mines. And in that case, there's quite a lot of degradation that we're seeing as a result of this substitution, because farmers are basically thinking that they would probably have more gains if they went for gold mining than, have to go through the process of mining cocoa with all the
Fatima, you've gone on to
Hi,
mute.
Fatma. Yes.
Sorry, apologies. So I was just saying, in that context where we're seeing this phenomenon and the substitution of cocoa farms for gold mines, universities have a role to play here, where they could actually be the voice that interrogates the trade-offs, that critiques it, that asks difficult questions, that talks about short-term versus long-term sustainability, that talks about issues around the loss of ecosystems and the erosion of cultural and economic resilience. So there are quite a lot of things that university can do about some of these very compelling issues that have got societal relevance, and whereby, it's affecting not just environment, but it's affecting also economy and people. So how can university how can they rise to this challenge of being able to speak truth to power? And how can the evidence that they produce be evidence that could also alert policymakers, or could sound an alert to policymakers? So this is one very, I'd say, very vivid example where universities can play a role. The second example I have is related to the critical minerals. We've been talking about just how important critical minerals are in Latin America, in Africa. And there is now a kind of geopolitical contest. There's a race, and different countries have got different interests in why they want to secure as many critical minerals as possible. Africa is home to many of these critical minerals, but it hasn't defined what criticality means. And we know that in as much as we're talking about the necessity for critical minerals to help in terms of scaling up renewable energy, which is going to be fundamental for the transition, the decarbonization transition. But what we are not saying, and what universities probably should be saying, is essentially how do we avoid some of these extractive systems that have been very much a fabric of the past? How do we move away from that? How do we ensure that continents like Africa do not continuously stay as a supplier of these raw materials, as the world's industry, but they're not able to host those very industries. They're not able to add value. So I think university has got a very key role to play in making sure that this narrative is out there and it's being heard by policymakers and the like. So it comes back to that sort of arbiter role that I just mentioned, that universities have that role to play that challenge function, and indeed that they should play that challenge function. Maybe I would just also say that there is a clear paradox also that often university, especially in Africa, cannot question power. They cannot fulfill, and if they cannot question power, they cannot fulfill their public mission. I think the moderator mentioned that there's this element of power, and we have to recognize that. So how do universities sort of navigate that space of being able to question power and at the same time exercising their public function? And there is an unspoken rule in Africa in the sense that, you know, universities are often not able to bite the hand that feeds them. So that, I think, it really constrains the role of university, and it also constrains the moral courage that they should have in being able to voice out some of the things that matter. Perhaps I would just end with saying that in as much as power is important, we can't talk about climate change, even within the public crisis context, by just focusing on biophysical impacts. This is very much about narratives. You know, it's the power of the narrative. And who defines the narrative? Who speaks? Who decides? We're now talking about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, but even that narrative is about power.
Ini ada orang. Enggak, ini ada orang juga. Ibu Fatima Denton.
So essentially, there has to be the recognition that climate change itself is a site of contestation. The climate change itself is about power. It's about the power of the narrative. It's about the power of the data. It's about the power of the models. And very often there's a dominance of northern epistemologies that very often, I would say, frame how African vulnerability, how African resilience should be termed. And this is a continent where a lot of adaptation is taking place, very ambitious adaptation is taking place, but oftentimes, because of power issues, they don't often make it into the mainstream narrative. And again, I think Sunil was talking about the whole aspect of indigenous knowledge. Most of us who in the process of or have been in the IPCC process recognize that often it's about how you advance scientific data, and that scientific data is competing with indigenous knowledge. And even though the IPCC has now got space where you can document indigenous knowledge, it's a case of, you know, how much of that data is actually visible, you know, so how the visibility of that data is often a problem. So I think universities have this dual responsibility to challenge epistemic hierarchies, but also to democratize knowledge production. And my last example is that if we are to do any meaningful climate action, universities need to democratize their climate knowledge. I take Ghana again as an example, where you have MPs, parliamentarians that need to debate climate action. They need to debate aspects related to climate change. But how can they debate these aspects if they don't understand the relevance of a 1.5 degrees? How can they debate these actions if they don't understand the importance of climate information services and what the services are meant to do in terms of planning, both in terms of now and future climate scenarios? So we need to have relevant data. And I think the university is the birthplace of how that data can then be democratized and how knowledge can also be used as an instrument to actually speak truth to power. So just to end and to say that the political economy of climate change in itself, the political economy of extraction, is very much a political economy of asymmetries. We live in a world of asymmetries. If you look at all the examples I've provided with the cocoa farms, with the critical minerals, there is an asymmetry there. There's unequal exchange. There's unequal value. And so I really feel that that is something that university can correct. That is something that university can add their knowledge to. And that's something that university can unpack. It can unpack this whole politics of decarbonization, the politics of climate finance, the politics of climate action, and the very many asymmetries that sit within that that space and that architecture. So I recognize that I probably have spoken for more than 10 minutes, so I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. After listening to all the three panelists, I can't help but feel a bit overwhelmed. And as somebody who is working in a university, thinking from practical level, before everyone else, can I just ask one question, a burning question? It can be, I mean, it's something that I have been struggling as a leader to kind of pick and choose which one first, because we have to set our priorities. So to all three panelists, I'd like to ask, what single change do you think would most accelerate climate-aligned education in a university? So if you can pick one, what kind of single change a university can start first in order to accelerate climate-aligned education? All right, who wants to start first? Fatima, Sunil, Marsha?
Maybe I can just say very quickly that the aspect of shaping public consciousness, I think that's, for me, is a low-hanging fruit. I live in a continent where the media is really thirsty and they want to know about climate change because they understand it. I would say if universities can be given power, I would say the power should be around how they can help in stimulating an appetite for climate change, but also in shaping public understanding of what climate change is about, which I think is evolving quite rapidly, even in this continent. But also, it doesn't have to be just the production of academic articles. We can tell stories. And storytelling, especially in Africa, it means a lot. We have an oral tradition, so we can use media programs, we can tell stories. There is a whole aspect of ethical responsibility here. And I would say that for me, that would be the one that stands out the most. I mean, the example of the parliamentarians that I really need to understand a little bit how they can vote budgets, how they can make decisions, how they can be more involved. I think universities have a lot of role to play in that sort of shaping of public consciousness.
Thank you, Fatima.
So,
yeah, I think that's very useful. Sunil, please.
yeah. So I would ask you to imagine that if indigenous elders and indigenous communities become our teachers in the classroom, what will they ask us to do? And perhaps the pedagogy of noticing, following, listening, and as Fatima said, storytelling, and again retelling those stories. Yeah, so if we continue those cycles, perhaps embedded in our action research, where those methods that they apply becomes part of our everyday curriculum, I think that is a very significant.
Can I go to Marsha next?
Thanks. Yeah, I would add on to all those ideas to also support the importance of policy from above. We always use in our research that the whole institution framework, we're thinking about research the teaching that happens in higher ed institutions, the operations, the footprint of institutions, and then community engagement. But then you need the overall kind of overall governance of the institutions to be supporting action in all those areas. So if you want to be able to go beyond individual students or student groups or individual academics or departments to really have the whole institution moving forward action, that high level strategic support for climate action is really important. So yeah, I would also advocate for kind of starting there and making a change, and the importance of having higher ed leaders on board with more than just, greenwashing approaches, but deeper level change that can support the types of approaches that my colleagues were just talking about.
Right. Thank you, Marsha. So we've got a couple of questions here. One is from Anilka to Sunil. So the question for Sunil is, could you share a few more examples of indigenous methodologies that you or your colleagues and students have applied when working with communities on climate change?
So one, as we said, that storytelling, but when we talk about storytelling, it's also not the linear narratives that mainstream academia deals with. The storytelling in local rural communities here, it is, again, it reflects on the entanglements, and it is embedded with the various art forms, the music, the street dances that they bring to it. So for example, in India, if you go to each state, we have our different storytelling forms. So those traditions have more meaning with respect to the myths, the legends, the historicities, and nature. And I think traditional storytelling, so if you go to Tamil Nadu, you'll find what is called as Villupattu. And if you go to Kerala, you find something related to Kada Prasangam. That is, you are going to narrate a story. That itself is the title of that. So there are certain storytelling traditions which are embedded in each community's everyday life that we need to work with. Second is that now what we could see is that there are many people from indigenous communities themselves who have come out with various kinds of movies and short films, etc. They might be in one part of the world, but they have a lot of synergy and resemblance to other indigenous communities. So movie screening and having discussions with them, that is another way we could work with it. And another important aspect is what happens in the indigenous community when everyday, as part of their everyday life, when there are discussions to be made, when there are decisions to be made, there are sharing circles. Different forms of sharing circles are there. And so try to engage in those platforms rather than creating a new platform of meetings and conversations. So I think whichever platform that facilitates shared conversations, shared listening, and telling and retelling of stories, I think these are important.
Thank you, Sunil, for the answer. I hope that answered the question. So we've got a couple of questions and comments in Portuguese. I'm not going to attempt to translate because I am in no capacity. So I'm going to ask for some help. Tristan, would you mind?
Sure, yeah. So we have a question here from Thais Kalanyata, which says, in a practical way, how can the university include the theme of climate justice and climate change in its undergraduate courses, either through specific courses or interdisciplinary approaches or community engagement programs, for example?
May I go here?
Yeah, sure, Sunil. And I'm guessing that question is for all panelists. So Sunil,
Yeah.
please.
So very interestingly, last year, we have a UG program in social work, and one course is on environmental studies with a focus on climate justice. So if you look at the curriculum, largely it is very traditional and very scientific in a way, where all the textbooks talks about what environmental management and studies is. And I was bored to teach that actually. So what I did is that I did experiment with indigenous epistemologies and indigenous ways of storytelling. I started with one session was on trees and how an indigenous community will start talking about trees. The next unit was I talked about crabs and intertidal zones. So every week I had a story to tell, which lasted for around 40 minutes. And then students were in the process of exploring those by going to the seashore, by going to the coast, by exploring forest, etc. I think giving more experiential learning for students and helping them to, and what happened, a very important consequence for me was that after 15 hours of my teaching, the students started going back and sharing these stories with their grandparents, who then started collecting from their childhood nostalgic stories about how things can be worked out, what was their when they were children, how their natural environment was, what could be done, how was the river Yamuna, what happened to that. So these kinds of questions started coming and the discussion started happening in their own families. So I got a wonderful assignment when they wrote their reflective journal and brought it back. It was so beautiful. And I really relished that relevance of going the indigenous way there.
Thank you, Sunil. Marsha or Fatima, do you want to add something?
That is new.
Sorry, we've got a very young audience joining us.
Sorry.
Very keen.
Yeah, no, I was saying that Sunil made the excellent points about the importance of experiential learning. I mean, I think that climate justice is often talked about in very complex, very theoretical ways, and we actually need that sort of lived experience. So I would say the way in which the university can engage citizenry, the way in which they can convene public debates, public engagements, I think would also be useful. A citizen science network, for instance, whereby different stakeholders are brought in to really understand around climate change, but also how power is made, how decisions are made around climate change. I think those are the kind of sort of very practical experience that we need also, so that it's not just about the contextual aspects or the conceptual aspect, but it's also about the practical everyday challenges related to climate change.
Yeah, and I can just build on that to say, I think comes back to, one of the things I mentioned briefly was just the importance of going beyond just the facts about the issues or kind of cognitive type knowledge about climate change, whether it's the science of it or the impacts it's having, or even information on the justice aspects, but that can be really overwhelming and disempowering, and people can shut off or shut down or feel hopeless and, be in grief or anxiety or denial or, all those kind of psychosocial aspects of engaging with a big existential issue like climate change. And so I think the examples that the colleagues have given of experiential learning and so on can really help with that in terms of feeling, coming to terms with those different emotions or what may be happening in your community, taking some action, seeing citizen science or seeing action being taken, and feel more empowered and hopeful rather than just overwhelmed and shutting off or leaving school and those sorts of things.
Yeah, if I can just add a little bit as well, coming from my own experience, because in our university we've got education for sustainable development, kind of interdisciplinary module for all students. Some students expressed that they feel very overwhelmed, but once they've got that experiential learning, going to communities, talking to them, listening to stories, they can start feeling some burden off them and start making realistic actions that are doable by them. All right. I'd like to invite people again, if you've got any questions, maybe if you don't want to type it, but you want to kind of just ask the questions directly, you can raise your hand. You can open the mic. Do we have any more questions? Before I ask another
Does the host have the ability to mute the mics that are on that
unfortunately, I
aren't
don't have.
intending to
Yeah, I don't
speak?
have. Yeah, I don't have that.
I think usually it's the top.
Yeah. Who is the host? Okay, I think that's already muted. Right. Anyone has any questions? Okay. Thank you, Tim. I was gonna ask that question. So, you know, we think alike. I think people who are in universities nowadays are very concerned about the issues of rankings and then grading, right? And so on. So from Tim Clark, should universities care about their SDG grading or ranking? Fatima? Marsha? Sunil? Sunil is laughing, so he has something to say.
See, I remember the conversation that I had with Tristan long time back when he was planning to write on, or he shared his book on higher education and sustainable development. So here the whole issue comes here is how we have conceptualized SDGs. The whole 17 SDGs itself comes with the tradition of a very mainstream knowledge tradition of classification. Now, this of segmenting various matters of sustainability into different boxes. But again, if you go back to indigenous epistemologies that I was talking about, there it is about entanglements. It is about relationality. Can we separate life underwater and life above water separately into two boxes? Yeah, or do you want to consider them as a relational perspective? And there comes the problem, because we as researchers will go to local communities and we will have our own tools of data collection. And one will be for life underwater and one will be for life above water. For them, life is together. Now, how are we going to, this categorization is problematic. So after 2030, I don't see a future for SDGs.
Oh, that's a big statement. Sunil, any reason why? Why not? Why no future after 2030?
You have the historicity of that, the Millennium Ecosystem standard that MEAs that we had looked before, then came SDGs, and now new concepts and new jargons will come fitting into it. But how much of that is applicable in everyday lives of people, to considering that the world is related and not fragmented?
Okay, thanks, Sunil. Marsha.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated because I think you know, global frameworks can have an impact in that they do get things on the table sometimes and can move things forward. So just sort of a wholesale rejection of them, you know, isn't necessarily the best approach. But on the other hand, if they're, you know, give the impression that something's being done when it's really not changing anything, then it can do more harm than good in a way, because people can sort of tick off that they're taking action while they aren't. And I always say, like, that, you know, before we had sustainability where it was sort of a three-legged stool, supposedly, where, you know, you can't have society, economy, or environment. If you take one away, the stool will fall over. And so you have to think of all three. And now, but what would happen a lot of times that people would, you know, take off if you're doing any one of them, they'd say, oh, we're doing sustainability, which is pretty much everything under the sun, right? So now we've got the 17-legged stool, which has the same problems where people can take off things, as I was saying. So it's, you know, I think it's problematic, and as I already mentioned, but of course, universities, I think certainly in the countries that I've worked in and lived in, do care about their rankings, definitely. And so how we engage them and the ranking systems to, and, you know, future frameworks to try and improve those, at least, because they're probably not going away anytime soon, I imagine.
So I think sometimes it can be helpful as well, having those frameworks, right? Particularly for those who are unsure where to begin, or if they don't have any references. But
Yeah.
you're right in saying that, it could be harmful if it becomes a tick boxing exercise and without seeing it as a whole. Thank you, Marsha. Fatima, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think essentially we shouldn't sort of just write off the SDGs. I think it can incentivize action, and that's a good thing. But I think that the metrics of SDGs and the metrics of so many other things, at least in Africa, the carbon trade, all different types of metrics are somewhat problematic. And the problem lies in how the SDG grading is implemented. So in Africa, SDG grading means that you'd have to be comparing different universities, wealthier universities with the poorer ones, and the ones that have got funding constraints with the ones that have are wealthier. And I think in that sense, sometimes because some of the universities are operating in that sort of funding environmental funding constraint, it means that we're not able to report. Their reporting mechanisms can be somewhat flawed. And we're not able to sort of talk more about the deep local impact. So that aspect of local impact may not make it through the final cut. So, and I also think that metric systems are about power and about epistemic sovereignty. So who decides what's an impact and who decides what's the standard and what's success? So these things I feel are very much, they very much depend on context. But I definitely think that we should not just sort of write it off. Sustainability, I think, is something that is aspirational, and we all aspire. We aspire to be more sustainable. But I would say that universities, in that sense, need to be a tool to somehow repurpose sustainability, to rethink it, and to see how best it fits into the wider sort of local context.
Yeah, thank you, Fatima. Anyone has any question? If not, then I can ask one more question in that sense. I was actually quite intrigued by Marsha's students experiencing mental health issues and so on. So I myself kind of felt like sometimes my students also feel people who are working in this climate action. So my question is, how can universities actually support students and the academics experiencing climate anxiety and despair? Because it can be overwhelming, right? So anyone wants to, Marsha, perhaps wants to kick off?
Yeah, I'm happy for anyone else to pitch in as well. Health, but more just, I guess, working in education, recognizing the impacts on mental health from, how we engage students in the issues and the impacts that has, as I've spoken about already. So I think some of the things we've already talked about in terms of how we do pedagogy are really helpful, in terms of experiential and action focused and so on. Even just recognizing that that's having supports or, for colleagues, making sure that people, recognize it's normal to feel overwhelmed, and, how you engage in that, like whether that's a process of kind of going through a grieving process and then being able to say, okay, but I loved what I'm losing the name now, but at the beginning with the opening comments, like I think the fellow said, can we postpone our extinction or something to that effect? Which is kind of how I think about it. It's probably inevitable, we're probably on that track, but like, let's dig in and give it a good shot to last as long as we can. So yeah, I think it's a really important conversation that I guess that's why I think we need to engage more in that. We're seeing more and more people doing work specifically in that area, but not so much, I think, in the higher ed sector so far.
Yeah, thank you, Marsha. Sunil and Fatima, do you want to jump in?
So, as I'm also not a mental health expert, but what I have found is that storytelling itself is healing and therapeutic. It do help students in distress to really come out, have conversations, and then taking students out of the classroom to nature. It really helps, especially in a city like Mumbai. It really, you need to get out of the classroom to the nature spaces, and they are healing. And I think both helps.
Okay, thanks, Sunil. Fatima. Anything you want to add? Hello, Fatima.
Hi, sorry, my internet just dropped, so I missed that. Did you?
No, I was just gonna say, do you want to add something to Sunil's and Marsha's point? Or we
I
can
missed
move
it.
on.
I missed
That's
the point. Yes,
That's
I
okay.
missed the point.
No worries. So we've got a question here from Sonia, and I do know that Tristan also has question. I'm going to go to Sonia first. What are the main challenges for Indigenous knowledge on climate issues to be included in university curriculum? And then I'll go to Tristan after this.
Do you want me to? Yeah, so mine's actually closely linked to that. So I was going to ask, I mean, the word university comes from a word meaning community or guild. And some people talk of a kind of intrinsic uniformity in that community or guild of scholars and learners, bringing us towards a single conception of knowledge. Given that, is it really possible for us to include the diversity of knowledge traditions that we know that we need for addressing the climate crisis, an ecology of knowledges, Indigenous knowledge, different cultural knowledge traditions? Is that ever possible, or do we need to start from scratch with a different institution?
Questions, very, very good questions there. Who wants to start first? I see Sunil is already unmuted, so I'm assuming you want to go first.
So there is a perspective in literature which and through other eye you see the other perspectives that are there. So how can we then have a conversation between these two knowledge frames or multiple knowledge frames? So the university should be a space where we are able to have those conversations and then look at the context and apply it. Perhaps we should do that.
Okay, thanks, Sunil. Fatima, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I recognize the points that that Tristan made, and I would argue that there is a need, Tristan, for plurality of knowledge. And in that sense, I don't think we can just sort of integrate or Indigenous knowledge. We can't just integrate it into existing academic systems, because that might be seen as tokenism. I think we have to find a way to make a paradigm shift. And Indigenous knowledge should be seen as authoritative knowledge, not an add-on. Otherwise it means that we're not recognizing the value of knowledge. And there's a lot of value in observation when indigenous knowledge tell us that they've observed the climate system and this is what happens during different times. And that knowledge, if it's not captured, it's lost. So I would say to a large extent, yes, important to have that sort of diversity of knowledge, but it cannot be an add-on. And I would also say that a lot of the knowledge, that we are basically, it's almost as if we're pitting one knowledge against the other. So there is definitely a deeper structural challenge there. And I would say also that in African universities, we still operate within the sort of colonial epistemic hierarchies. We privilege one knowledge above another. So I would say it's important for us to basically consider the value of indigenous knowledge. I think it's changing. I'm really pleasantly surprised to see that it's changing. But I still feel that some of the forms that indigenous knowledge can take in terms of oral tradition, the narrative, the observation, those forms have not been recognized as important enough, and they haven't really made it into the way in which the different ways in which we capture knowledge. So we often go with peer review knowledge, and that's what we tend to prioritize. But the forms of knowledge where knowledge is captured through oral tradition, through observation, that aspect of knowledge is not fully captured in the way that would help us advance some of the narrative on climate change.
Thank you, Fatma. Marsha, do you want to make?
Sure, thanks. It's 11:30 p.m. here, so I'm feeling short on smart thoughts. But I think I agree with everything that's been said. And I think universities are colonial institutions in a sense, and this idea of education being just formal education, being in buildings, and those kind of ideas. It's, I think, part of the decolonizing work in different contexts too, is recognizing the long history of various diverse forms of education that have been happening in communities outside of what were originally Western European institutions that then moved around the world. And so, but obviously it's complicated, and how we don't necessarily doesn't make countries don't necessarily, or communities don't want to do away with higher ed because of that history necessarily. So how do we change what higher ed looks like? And I think there are lots of great examples of that where you have, like the article I put in the chat, where you have a Indigenous-led higher ed institution in Nunavut in Canada, for example, and there's different programs that have been run out of other universities that are like Dene land-based camps, where whole courses are offered outside of an institutional environment on the land with Indigenous knowledge prioritized. So yeah, I think there's increasingly lots of great models, and getting us to recognize, think about when we do higher ed or any education in a classroom, in a building, it's within that setting, that place is teaching something that we may not be intending to teach about what knowledge looks like, or we need to broaden that understanding of knowledge and the places where we can learn.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marsha, for that one. I couldn't tell that it's already 11:30 because you are still obviously giving very, very great comments and remarks over there. On that note, though, I'm aware that we are running out of time, so I'm really sorry to a few other audiences here who have asked questions. I'm really sorry we won't be able to answer them, but I do know that a couple of panelists have already shared their thoughts in the comment boxes. So as we've heard from the panelists and the discussions from all of you today who have shared the questions, remarks in the comments boxes, we are navigating a turbulent global moment. And yet universities remain one of the few, we still have to be hopeful and optimistic, still one of the few institutions capable of thinking across decades, convening diverse voices and generating knowledge for the public good. The poly crisis can be overwhelming. Marsha raised the issue of the decline in mental health and well-being of young people in these global slow emergencies, another new term that I've learned today. But it also offers, hopefully, we see that it also offers an opportunity for us to rethink how we teach, how we research, govern, and collaborate. Universities are not simply observers of this historical moment, but I'm sure all of us believe that universities and us here are participants who must choose whether to reproduce the status quo or help transform it. Fatima reminded us about climate citizenship, where universities play an integral role in catalyzing public participation and inspiring actions among citizens. So really, university needs to think beyond research. Then Fatima, Sunil also discussed the importance of democratizing knowledge and shaping narratives, one of which Sunil mentioned about using indigenous framework as a knowledge framework with the concept of relationality to help local communities understand better and connect better with the climate action agenda. As we all know, the agenda, discourses, the narratives in the mainstream media can feel foreign to the local communities and the general public, sometimes even for me. So in this time of global challenges, connecting across borders matter more than ever. So I really thank our panelists. Obviously, Marsha is very, very late over there. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we've got Fatima as well. And Sunil, I think it's evening, around your time, late afternoon, Sunil, or?
Here it's 6 o'clock in the evening.
6 o'clock in the evening, ready for dinner. Fatima, what time is it over there?
It's noon, so it's okay.
It's noon. It's okay. So we are similar in that sense. I'm getting ready as well for our lunch. Hopefully, all of you are having a great time. Thank you so much again for all three of you for sharing your invaluable insights. I also would like to thank all of you, all the audience participants for showing up, for engaging and for being part of this shared effort to think about our collective futures. Let's continue this conversation beyond this room. I've seen that some people have already kind of shared their contacts and the links to their works. Let's collaborate for a better future. On that note, I'd like to conclude our panel for today's conference. I will pass this opportunity back to, is it Tristan? Shall I give this back to you, Tristan?
Sonia.
Yeah, or Sonia. Right, Sonia.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for leading this wonderful panel today. And now we are going to go to our parallel paper sessions. We will have three parallel paper sessions today. One from 9:45 to 11:15. The another one starts 11:30 to 13, 1 p.m. And the another one starts 2 p.m. through 3 p.m. and 30 minutes. I think we have a problem with some microphone that is open.
You're on mute, Sonia.
Sorry. For the parallel sessions, we will have 5 rooms. room A, room B, room C, room D, and room E. And each one, we are going to a different link. We are joining in these rooms to the Google Meet. And then you can choose in which one you are going to take part. We have the coordinators of these rooms as well, and the paper presenters who are usually 4 or 5 in each room. Okay, I think then if now we can finish then this moment that we are all together, and then we can meet in the parallel paper sessions, or after that we will join tomorrow. We will continue, and those who are not here in Brazil are welcome to join us online for the main panel sessions, the main panel discussion that we will have tomorrow and the other days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professora Sônia, professor Trista. Eu quero agradecer a tradução simultânea da Natalie e da Teresa, que estão dando esse suporte na tradução simultânea. Muito obrigado. Nós agora de manhã já tivemos 94 participantes, entre pesquisadores, professores nacionais e internacionais. I just would like to thank you to Natalie for her translation to English. And just to register that now in the morning, we have 94 participants at all. Thank you very much. And then let's meet in the other room.
Thank you. Bye.